Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today as we are going to be talking about overcoming virtual team fatigue. With me this morning, I have one of our own Dion coaches and consultants, Vicki Walker, as well as our CEO and founder, Steve Dion.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody for attending our webinar today. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day and looking forward to talking with you about a subject that we're seeing is very critical these days is virtual team fatigue. Ironically, we are virtual to share this with you. Joined with me today is my good friend, Vicki Walker. Thanks, Vicki, for joining us.
Happy to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
For those of you that don't know Vicki, she is a leadership coach and consultant and expert facilitator with Dion Leadership. I've had the pleasure of working with Vicki for many years, and prior to the coach consulting world, Vicki came out of talent management roles and brings a lot of expertise from early on in career, doing things in plant leadership, unionized environments, all the way through working with strategic partners at Ernst & Young and a whole bunch of experiences. And why I asked Vicki to join me today is Vicki has had the pleasure of doing a lot of team development over this last year in the COVID environment. So I'm looking forward to turning over the stage to you, to Vicki, to share more experience as we go through this today. But before we get going, I just wanted to ground you on who we are and why we're talking about this subject today. So for those of you that have attended our webinars before, I share this first as a reminder to say that one of the things that we think that's important, and we hope you do too, is to create an environment where your employees start every day excited and end every day accomplished. So all the work that we're doing is really around trying to create those dynamics. I know personally, I've had situations in my life where I didn't have jobs that allowed me to do that. And I wasn't being able to be not just the worker I should be, but the father, the husband, the person in my life that I wanted to be. And I know how important that is. And we're really driven on creating dynamics where we can create a better society because we have better work relationships. And we know team development is a really important part of that. So the service offerings that we have are on this screen. And what we're talking about today is really this team effectiveness area. But I guess I would say that this really overlaps to individual leadership coaching elements, as well as when we say leadership programs, we mean, training classes and activities around that, and even assessing the type of person that should belong on the team. So team development is really woven into a lot of what we do, but it's really a specific practice area, and we're going to unpack that with you today. These are some of the client partners that we work with. Vicki will be sharing some examples from the be named nameless of folks on this screen, and have done team development in many of these organizations, in global organizations, with global teams, with diverse teams. And this is a really challenging issue in any industry right now. So what we're going to cover today is what makes teams strong, the impact on the virtual nature of teams, how to diagnose your team health, and then offer some very specific practical solutions and ground this in some research and some best practices as well. So I'm going to kick some of that off, and then I will turn it over to Vicki to provide real life, real world examples. So wanted to start first with a study of teams. So team dynamic issues or team performance was already an issue pre-COVID. And this is a study that Wiley did with over 20,000 employees in 2020. So this was happening right around the time that COVID was starting to happen. And what we knew even prior to COVID is that 60% of our time is spent in teams. So we do a lot of our work in a team-based environment. And teams are more complex, more fluid, and more dispersed than they ever were, even prior to COVID again. And what that looked like is that 28% of people report being on teams with someone even in another country. And teams are more complex. So most employees report, 76% of employees report sitting on 2 or more types of teams and 2 or more teams. So again, a lot of work is being done in a team-based environment. And specifically the type of teams we're talking about here most people sit on a department team. So 81% of people are part of a department team. But in addition to that, people are managing being on a project team, a cross-functional team, some other matrix teams. So the team environment was already pretty darn challenging and complex even prior to this virtual world. So what's happening on teams? This study reported that 4 out of 5 people said they really don't trust team members that they work with, that they're not acknowledging weaknesses and they really struggle with the team members they have. Therefore, 55% of people are saying we don't make commitments as a team. And then there isn't any accountability for results. So 3 out of 5 people are reporting taking responsibility. So being on a team isn't just about the personal frustration, it's about getting job performance completed. And that in this study, just as COVID was starting to happen, these are the reports. The impact then is 71% of people said that there's a lack of trust that creates a toxic work environment. That's a pretty strong word. That isn't just, it's a wasteful hour. It's a toxic environment. That's something to be very concerned about. And productivity, of course, nosedives when that happens. And this next statistic is the one that I think is most alarming and challenging, is that 42% of people have reported that they have left a job due to a bad team experience. So teams are a real important element of organizational performance. And I would say that a lot of time is being wasted in organizations if it's not managed well. For me doing this for over a decade, and Vicki and I have had this conversation, and I think this is one of the more untapped areas that talent management and OD professionals have available to them as a way to help organizations perform better. So before we move forward into understanding additional elements of teams, we wanted to pause and say, COVID then happened. So I just recently wrote an article that was published in Training Industry Magazine. You might have seen it in our social media posts, talking about how this went from a sprint to a marathon. So, I think at the beginning of this COVID, we thought, we can do a virtual team thing. We just have to do this for a couple months. We'll be back in the office. And one of the things we want to raise by having this webinar today is that this is a long-term play. We are going to be in some type of environment with virtual and remote work. I could do a whole nother study that's out there about, 80% of organizations are reporting not coming back to an office completely. There'll be blended teams going forward. So right now, maybe everybody's working remote. It's a different challenge when you have some in one office, some in another, some coming in certain days. So this idea of managing teams and managing work virtually is not going away. So with that, we thought we'd pause and get a little bit of a measure of what your organizations are doing. Vicki?
Great, thanks, Steve. So on the screen, you'll see not only do we want your input, but we thought we'd show you a fun tool that also gets you engaged early on in a virtual environment. And you'll see the poll up on your screen. And we're asking what has the impact of COVID had on your organization's team? So you'll see the results there starting to come in. I am seeing made healthy teams stronger, made healthy teams weaker, struggling teams improved, struggling teams continue to struggle, no real impact on teams. So we're watching some of these answers come in, and it'll be really exciting to see what you all think are happening in your organizations. We're at about 75% now, poll closed. So you should see the polls results up on your screen. We see a made healthy teams stronger at 37%, which is great to hear. So some teams have jumped in and taken the necessary steps to make their teams stronger in a virtual environment. Some organizations we found were virtual, so some of this has been not that much change for some organizations as well. We've had a little bit here, 4% at making teams, healthy teams weaker, struggling teams improve, so those are small amounts. And then we see here struggling teams continue to struggle at the same as the healthy teams stronger. So that's an interesting dynamic. The good ones got better and the struggling teams struggle still. And then a little bit here of a neutral of no impact on teams or real impact on teams. What we are seeing a lot of is kind of this, it depends on the assessment, perhaps you said, of your teams initially as to whether or not your team was struggling. And some people really hadn't done that diagnosis before COVID to understand. And so it's a bit of a self-reflection. And sometimes that's hard to think back pre-pandemic, because like Steve said, we thought this might be a month. And here we are over a year later and still in it. And so that kind of long-term effect is starting to really impact our teams, especially the teams that maybe were struggling a little bit before the pandemic.
Thanks, Vicki. And as we get going here too, I know this is a poll in a traditional sense. As we go through this today, please use the chat feature. We'll monitor that, and we are going to leave time open to ask Coach Vicki how to handle your team and to get your suggestions and ideas. So feel free to chime in, chat in. We're trying to create a community here as well, so we ask you to be active in that. What we'd like to do next is we have one more study that's a post-COVID study that's specifically on virtual teams. So I wanted to take a couple minutes to unpack some of those findings with you as a next step. I'll do that. And then Vicki is going to talk about some specific case studies of real world teams and team examples. And then we'll kind of summarize those two things together and then allow time for dialogue within the group. So with that, the study I wanted to share with you, and both of these studies, by the way, we will share the PDFs of them with you when we send you the replay of today's event. And this one in particular, we love to use studies, data, academic research where we can to build our programs, processes, and tools, and then bring a practical bent to it. And this particular study is a great find. It's a metadata research analysis of multiple studies over longitudinal years of looking at virtual teams. And this was published in May of last year after we were in the COVID environment. So one of the things we wanted to talk first about is what is different with a virtual team. Well, one thing is the team dynamics that are at play. How teams work and how they operate are going to be very different in this environment, and we need to be mindful of that. How they communicate is also a really important element. Communication looks very different in a virtual environment. Therefore, it leads to not having as much consensus when you're not in a physical room, and the levels of conflict vary. So most of the times, by vary, we mean that there isn't as much conflict. People aren't engaging, they can easily disengage. And the level of social interaction isn't there as often. You don't have those minutes in between things. You're not talking about something with each other, building relationships, feeling the emotion that comes out with another person, talking through, interactions. And then therefore, team outcomes can be very different. Key finding here is that computer communication is negatively impacted with team effectiveness. So what's happening here is the amount of information that's shared is less, and therefore it hinders how the team is going to operate, and their cues of how they work together are delayed. And as you can see in the sub findings here, it's negatively connected with team effectiveness, both in quantitative and qualitative studies. So what do we do about that? That's the next slide. Well, second element that happens here is physical dispersion is an issue. So asynchronicity and how the team works together is a part of the problem, and specifically over different time zones. So teams don't work together as often. They have shorter meeting times to meet. This requires more coordination and delay. And so they're not co-creating information together, and it's reducing their communication with each other. And there's just becomes misunderstandings and relationship issues. So the particular factors that we want to look at that were shown in this study is that trust goes down because of those two elements, how you communicate and how frequently you communicate. And that creates a problem with, and this is an academic study again, but social cohesion here, which is really how we trust and work with each other and the bonds that we have to make better decisions and how we share information. And what it culminates into is what they call transitive memory here. And transitive memory is really the muscle memory or the culture that the team has. So teams that form together well and teams that form together in a physical environment tend to create more commonalities to know how to solve problems and to solve problems quicker. So what we need to do in a team development intervention is to build trust, build social cohesion, figure out better ways to share information, and create this transitive memory or this muscle memory or property in which we can know how to work and how to work better effectively. The good news is that leadership style doesn't correlate with team effectiveness. So you don't have to be a certain type of leader to work in a virtual team environment. What we do know, though, is that co-coordination of activities positively impacts a team. So when we work together in a physical environment, we tend to co-create more often. If we're in a virtual environment and we don't meet as frequently, or we meet in dyads or triads, other members are not participating in the team, and then therefore they're not co-creating. So that's a really important part of team effectiveness, is the ability for the team to do things together. And that's an opportunity for the team to figure out. And these are from the study. We already believed these things because we do them as well, but team building, particularly at the start of a team, has a strong positive effect of team outcomes. And you'll see when we send you the study that these studies say that if you spend some time on process and building trust and communication practices, that the team will build more effectively. And particularly teamwork training is really important as well. So team, not just talking about team process or team activities, but how to work in a team is really an important activity. Last is team, they call reflexivity and debrief sessions. So pausing, having a team stop and pause and say, how are we doing? What process is happening here for us to be able to be more effective is also correlated statistically with teams performing better.
Sorry, now I'm messing you up.
No problem. Well, I'm glad I can at least see my slides now.
There you go.
So last piece, and then I will turn it over to you because you're the slide after this, is next one.
Yep. So I can take this from here, actually.
Go ahead, Vicki.
Okay, great. So thanks, Steve. So now you know why I let you do all the statistics. That's way better in your wheelhouse. So I love to talk about the teams that we're working with currently. So some of the current client team challenges, and they shall remain nameless today for confidentiality reasons, but we're seeing a lot of things that perhaps, I guess a good way to say it is, we bring our bodies in for health checkups or physicals once a year, at least, right? And we bring our cars in for regular tune-ups. It only makes sense that our teams need the same kind of regular check-in and tune-ups as well. So this is perfectly normal, and in fact, it's very healthy. What you often find are teams or leaders that think the only time that you do this check-in is when there's a problem. What we're finding is actually before there's a problem, it's super healthy. So there were a lot of teams that instead of pausing all team or leadership development at the pandemic start, actually jumped full-fledged into it and said, this is a time of change. We need to have somebody helping us to make sure we don't lose traction in our teams and in fact get better. So they may have been, when we saw in the poll, the teams that were up there on the top, the healthy teams getting healthier. They really saw this as an opportunity for organizational change and addressed it as such. What we're also seeing, though, is that many organizations and leaders are struggling with seeing this as a true organizational change. And so leaders and teams misunderstand that this is similar in nature to change management experience. So they're under communicating. They're kind of going business as usual. They just said, hey, we'll take it from in person to online. no difference, but there is a lot of differences. So they're not spending the extra energy that's needed during a true change experience. What we're also seeing is then leaders are tending to get a bit frustrated, like, why is my team not performing at the level they should be? And not really recognizing the root problem and maybe trying to band-aid some of the things that they're seeing, and really doing that deep dive health check diagnosis is really going to help uncover what are some of the building blocks that are really causing this trouble. And what we're seeing as the number one reason is lack of trust. It really goes to how much we built trust without even realizing it because of in-person interactions. One of my best friends I met walking out of work one day in our building. We were on different floors. We may have never met. We certainly wouldn't have become best friends. And we happened to walk out at the same time. And we understood that we had the same similarities. And those things aren't happening. Walking from meetings, walking to the parking lot, getting in elevators, those things aren't happening. And we're underestimating how much that's taking away from our interpersonal effectiveness and our relationships. We're having a lack of feedback. So feedback that would normally happen, kind of that, hey, do you have a minute after a meeting, or stopping by the doorway and saying, can I talk to you about something quick? Those casual conversations aren't happening. So what's happening is those issues kind of go unresolved. You think, well, I don't want to make a special meeting because we have so many meetings as it is, and it'll just go away. But they don't go away. They kind of sit there in the baggage claim. And so some of those things, if left untethered, then they can fester and ultimately blow up. What we're also seeing, besides that lack of natural feedback that may happen in person, is that there's too many conversations happening via email, chat, and text. This is besides the lack of trust, but this actually draws to the lack of trust. I am seeing so many teams having all their conversations in text, chat, and email. And they're wondering why they're running into these big arguments or lack of accountability and a whole variety of things that stem from thinking you can have a conversation via email, because it really doesn't allow for the appropriate productive and healthy conflict and buy-in that's necessary to get to the right accountable, committed decisions and results. So we all know that we are in meetings. Everybody I talk with is like, oh, I've been in meetings back to back all day. So what's happening too is we're scheduling, and I'm just as guilty of it, we're scheduling meetings back to back because you don't have to go anywhere. You just have to log off one Zoom and go into Microsoft Teams and then go to another Zoom. And you're not allowing the breaks in between, whereas you would have allowed that because you had to walk back to your office or something else in between. And you had those natural breaks, and we're not having that now. So everybody is having meeting overload. So what's happening is people are saying, well, I don't want to put another meeting on somebody's schedule just to talk about our relationship or give some feedback because we already have enough meetings. So what's happening is the meetings we are having are very transactional in nature, and that key piece of relationship building that really builds that vulnerability-based trust with team members isn't happening because we just don't want to put another meeting on somebody's calendar. So one of the things that we use here, and for those of you on the phone, we're looking at a pyramid from Patrick Lencioni's work of high-performing teams, and it's the building blocks of team effectiveness. So it starts with the building block of trust, and that being the most important building block, moves up through conflict, commitment, accountability, and results. So one of the things we're finding is that some teams may find it helpful to just do a full team tune-up on all of the behaviors noted. And some may feel that it's more of a need in one or two behaviors, such as, you know, I feel like our trust is falling apart. Let's really do a deep dive in that. Or how to achieve and engage in healthy and productive conflict. We find oftentimes people misunderstand what conflict is. Conflict tends to be a negative when it's the first thing we hear, negative thoughts pop into our head. And so we find that teams are either highly conflict, which is fighting and arguing and not productive, or conflict averse. We've heard that kind of Midwest nice. And So there's a lot of that happening, and teams will decide to focus specifically on that. Some will just say, I want to focus more on the achieving commitment, accountability, and results. Some organizations have found themselves changing how they work because of this whole virtual or hybrid. And so perhaps there's challenges in how to lead in a matrix environment. I'm getting a lot of that too, or how to effectively navigate during times of change with transformational leadership. I'm getting that as well. So these are all pieces of components that we can put into this building block pyramid based on Patrick Lencioni's work. They're perfectly designed for tune-ups, team tune-ups. So how is a virtual team facilitation different? Well, the first thing that is the most different is we used to have these 1 or 2 day offsites. We'd all go to a hotel, and there's extra team building that goes on there, especially if you're staying over, you have dinner together, and so we're not doing that. What we're doing that we have found very effective, and we've been doing it a lot, or I've been doing it a lot in the last year, is these multiple 2 to 3 hour events. And so what we're structuring instead of that 1 or 2 day offsite is we're structuring a 2 hour event 1 week. We have some pre-work that goes ahead of that. We have the event. 2 hours is great because you don't really need a break in there. 2 hours goes by a lot faster than you'd think. And so we do that. We have some pre-work, a 2 hour event, some post-work to keep the continuity going and the learning continuing to evolve. And then we go into another 2 hour event, maybe some pre-work again and some post-work and perhaps even another. So it's more of that series of small quick hits versus that what I think is really long 1 or 2 days offsite. So the virtual piece in those multiple short events seems to be working really well with teams. They kind of like that quick hit and doing some self-work on their own. What we've also found, and I noticed it in the chat that somebody also commented about this, the virtual environment makes it easier for some people to be vulnerable and candid and speak up. I have some organizations that now say, even when we can do town halls of 500 plus people in person, again, we're not going to, because when we do the town halls virtually, we get the best questions because people that wouldn't raise their hand in front of that large group and ask a question because they're just not comfortable there are asking it in chat, and we get the best questions. So we have organizations now changing how they're doing meetings, teams, events, because they're finding that there are positives with this virtual environment. What we found on teams, you all know there's teams, right? They say that one person does 80% of the talking and the other 20%, the whole rest of the team does 20% of the talking. What virtual environment allows is those people that maybe aren't as comfortable speaking up when somebody's right next to them or right in front of them are comfortable speaking up when you're in your own comfortable space. And so those, you're hearing a lot more from the people that you didn't hear from before, and teams are starting to realize the value of that because perhaps they didn't engage those people before, and now they feel more engaged and able to speak up. So that's a real plus that we're seeing, and I was happy to see that somebody commented similarly in the chat. The other thing is the need for strong facilitation is more present. I love working with teams. I say at about 10 or less because it's easy to manage. I can still scroll through all of the photos and the videos. I do ask, especially when we're doing a team session, that they are on video. And I can scroll through 10 or less is really easy for me to still scroll through, see facial expressions, body language, really get 99% of that vibe that you get in a room, and it's still manageable. So teams work really well in this virtual environment because they're typically about that size 10 or less, and it's manageable for the facilitator to go through and be able to see everybody at the same time when they're speaking. So that's really important though for the facilitator to be able to do that, to pick up on those same cues that you would have picked up on in person. So there's a couple other things that we showed you. We showed you a poll up front, so that's kind of fun. You can engage those things in, but the ease of use with polls use of chat, breakout rooms, whiteboards. And I don't know about you, but I don't like writing on flip charts. I know I'm in the wrong industry for not liking to write on flip charts, but I don't. But the whiteboard's great, because now I don't have to worry about my writing and is it going all askew, and because I'm typing right into a whiteboard, it's so much easier. And there's no need to copy it over into documented notes. It's already there for you. It's super easy. I find that technology use wonderful. Other things, there's additional tools that you can use, like Google's Jamboard. I don't know if you've used that, but a colleague introduced me to that and I love it. It's the ability, I use sticky notes all the time. And so Jamboard allows you to use that same structure of doing sticky notes with different things and do it all online. So there's some great tools. You have to learn about them. It's a little change for all of us if we haven't been using them before, but once you get the feel for them, they're pretty easy and they're really good to start engaging into the virtual team environment. Along that line, you know, some of that's kind of fun, but then we also say you really need to be more intentional to find ways to really add fun into your virtual environment. So I've seen things such as cooking classes with teams, escape rooms, scavenger hunts. You know, there's some of those there's online gaming competitions. There's all kinds of things to do to engage your team in team building activities. That's a little outside of the kind of team content facilitation, but it's an opportunity to engage fun in the virtual environment as well. There's simple things too. You don't need to go full out and do something huge. I was recently participating in one where in the waiting room they came in, there was loud music and it kind of got everybody all, you know, loosened up. And there was a chat feature that said, you know, put something in there that people may not know about you. And I'll tell you, I was actually afraid to put something in because I didn't think I had anything good enough, because the stuff people were putting about things people may not know about you were fantastic. So there's easy things you can engage into making it fun. You can ask people up, you know, do something different every time that engages their home environment. Bring your pet to work. We all know we bring our pets to work by accident now that we're virtual. So maybe engage in something fun with that, because we all know they're there. If you have a dog like me, as soon as someone knocks on the door, everybody knows you have a dog. So there's fun ways to engage even being at home. And it does build that relationship because you start to learn a little bit about each other that maybe you wouldn't have gotten in person in the workplace. So some practical virtual team considerations. So you're probably all thinking, yeah, tune-up workshops sound great, but what can I start doing with my team already, right away, without us, like just from after today forward? So a couple of tips that we've put together as maybe some best practices and easy things that you can start doing is be intentional about how you meet. Ensure that you're matching the purpose of the meeting with the process. As I said, we're all in meeting overload, so be really intentional about your meetings. Use the technology. We talked about some of the fun technology. Some of it just is really better technology to be able to use some of the whiteboarding and the breakouts, you know, smaller groups for better decision-making and dialogue. Agree and be clear about camera on or off. We have some organizations that have camera off days and everything that's done on that day is camera off. Some organizations say, yeah, that doesn't maybe work for us, but we can be really clear on this meeting needs camera on, this meeting doesn't really need it. And so, you know, be clear about when camera on and camera off is. It really helps kind of with that Zoom fatigue that people are talking.
I'm monitoring chat here as you're talking to, and there's a lot of chatter about this idea of when you don't see somebody in the camera, you have trouble interacting, building a, relationship understanding, and some ideas about, when do we use cameras and when don't we, and making rules around that, having camera on when you're speaking, so I think we could explore that even more. I think that's a really important element now.
And it's important to think about, do we need camera on because we need to gauge people's responses, or is this something that is more a inform out and we don't need to see, people could be off camera for a little bit, because this Zoom fatigue, even though I guess you could call it Teams fatigue, but it's virtual online team fatigue, And what happens too is another thing is perhaps you need cameras on because you do want to see people's facial expressions, body language. Sometimes if you have a really well working team where you already know each other, and maybe less important to see some of that because you already have healthy engagement and trust and relationships built. Sometimes for new teams, the video on is really good because you're all just meeting each other for the first time or getting to know each other, and it's a newer team, then that may be important. So understanding kind of when that importance is. One other tip, I was reading a study about the Zoom fatigue, and what they said was, and I don't know how well people know this, but encourage your teams to turn off their own images. So one of the things they are saying is really contributing to that Zoom fatigue is how often we're looking at ourselves in the video. We wouldn't look at ourselves that often in the mirror all day. And what it's causing is our brains are working in overdrive and they're constantly critiquing ourselves because we're looking at ourselves. So an easy thing to do is turn off your own self video. You're still on video, but you're not watching yourself in the little screen the whole time that you're talking. And that has shown to help people with some of that Zoom fatigue because you're not looking at yourself, you're looking at your teammates. It automatically pops up, so you have to set that setting in your technology. So be purposeful in asking open-ended questions to ensure all team members are participating and engaged. Don't just ask, was this a good meeting? People are going to go, yeah, what are they going to say? So ask open-ended questions and really, be mindful if someone is speaking over others or interrupting, they may not even realize it. It could be a blind spot of theirs, but you see it, give them that feedback, pull them aside privately after the meeting and say, I'm not sure if you realize this, but I noticed that it seems like you're interrupting or talking over people. And I feel like that's, hindering some other people to contribute and add value, and you probably don't even notice it. And so find those opportunities. People may not even realize what they're doing, but if you've noticed something that could be improved upon and it's actionable feedback to help the person be better, point those things out. Don't just let them go unspoken. And so we talked about this meeting effectiveness. Really, really analyze your meeting effectiveness. Does your meeting really need to be a full hour? Could it be a half hour or 45 minutes? Consider booking it for an hour, but really timing it to 50 minutes and giving people a freebie of 10 minutes back in their day. That makes a huge difference for people, especially that are booking their meetings back to back. So those little breaks really make a difference in kind of that fatigue that teams are having and people are having. So take time. Another great tool is take time at the end of each meeting to gather input from the team. Again, not was the meeting good, but what was the most effective part of the meeting for you? What would you do differently if you had one thing to change? So asking for an answer that needs to give input, not just a yes or no, to really help continuously improve your meetings. In essence, think of your meetings as prime real estate. You wouldn't waste a square foot of prime real estate. Treat your meetings the same way and make sure you're getting the most out of the time that people are spending together. So I'm going to turn this, I'm going to turn this to you, Steve, to talk a little bit about our team development process and a little bit more about some tips and tools that we can provide to our listeners today.
And thank you for driving our PowerPoint today.
No problem.
So our team development process really has been the same as a framework pre-COVID or with the intact team or with the virtual team. But as Vicki mentioned, it take some different nuances and activities to it. And when we say, virtual teams, we don't mean the team meeting itself. We mean the virtual team and all the elements that go into that, the meetings in between meetings, the one-on-ones, all the relationships that you have. Some of that happens in a team meeting event, but a lot of it happens outside of that. So we have a 3-step process that we suggest that you think about with your teams as well. Step 1, understand and assess what's going on with your team. So if you're looking at doing sort of an intervention at some point to say, as we saw in the data, managing process matters. So taking a step out once in a while to say, how are we doing and how should it look different? First is understanding that. So what we do is we typically recommend doing interviews with individual team members, as Vicki just mentioned. What's happening well, not happening well? Are you getting your needs met? Where is that happening? Really diagnosing that and creating a roadmap for what you want your team to do and be different. It's not all things, it can be very targeted. Then the second step is to build awareness, commitment, and skill, like any other change management effort, right? You got to get people to understand and unfreeze from the current situation, realize that we want to do something different. And what happens in these environments is I think teams just start to settle to the next level of not talking. And all of a sudden you don't even realize how infrequent you're communicating or how you're not sharing information. And having a moment where you can step back and kind of look at the forest over those trees and say, how are we doing, is a really important element. And then teams don't even realize sometimes that they're not being as effective as they could. So how we would unpack that many times, as Vicki mentioned, is with the team development process or some form of individual assessment so the team can understand each other's styles, having a dialogue. But, you know, there's team building that's important in terms of building trust, but there's also team effectiveness and just talking through very specific ways in which we say, how do we make decisions as a team based on the type of team it is? We saw data earlier, right? You could be on a department team that might look very different than a project team or a matrix team that's going to be squatted. We're going to meet 6 times to solve a problem and then go away, but helping to build awareness, competence, and skills. And one of the things we find with teams, especially executive teams, most of those executive folks say, you know, I don't need leadership development. I've been through all those classes. That's why I'm already here at this VP level. And many times we're being asked to work with the senior level team. And what we find is while Vicki is leading a team development process and dialogue and these discussions, these facilitated discussions, we're weaving in skill building activities and they're practicing it in the moment. So they're learning how to engage in conflict. So it's like a conflict management class without saying you're in a training class. So there's kind of a 2-for-1 element that many times happens with the team. And then last, and I think most important, to move it from a team building effort to a team development effort is very specific sustainability strategies. So as we go through the structured dialogue and conversation, we're specifically also capturing team commitments. We're capturing the aha moments. We're capturing when a team says, we shouldn't do this anymore, or we need to do this more often, or we're going to agree to behave in a certain way, or we're going to include these other people. Capture those, and by the end of an effort, a team development initiative, have, whether you call it a code of conduct, a manifesto, leadership principles, ways in which you can take a formal artifact that you can that can live on for a period of time. Sometimes it's RACI charts. Sometimes it's looking at accountability, responsibility between each other. But our team facilitators are unpacking this process to create some way that you can sustain how you're going to work together. And how is it going to look different? You know, how it looked when we were all in a physical room was one thing. How it looked when we're all remote is another. Now, next year, it might look even different. How's it going to look when some of us are in an office and some of us are not? Are we going to agree that we can have a team meeting and somebody calls in? All those things need to keep, this team process is cyclical and we need to keep evolving it regularly. So back to that earlier study, what we do know though, is that team development processes, when you do these activities, do correlate to these results. They're improving morale, which is important. It's finding barriers to remove performance obstacles. It's improving process and procedures. So it's not really just about, do we like each other? Did we have fun? But are we more efficient in the way that we take the knowledge we each bring to the table to solve common problems? And defining goals and objectives and getting clarity on that. Your team 1, team 2 exercises, we sometimes talk about that with as an activity. Improve the ability to solve problems, and hopefully overall is improving organizational performance, as we saw that 60% of work is done through teams.
Thanks, Steve. So let me talk a little bit about the facilitation of working through some of these and what we're seeing out there in industry. So we're finding there's a variety of needs with teams that are surfacing with our new way of working. And like Steve mentioned, our new way of working is going to continue to evolve. So these are a few of the more common areas where we're helping teams out. And it's funny because I work with a lot of CEOs and their executive team, and maybe going into it, they think, I know all this stuff, but they forget this stuff because they're not actively doing it every day and they're not making the space. So that's what we do in coaching and training, is we make the space for them to hone their skills and really update the way they do things and work together differently as a team. Those team dynamics, I just received a call from a team yesterday that I've worked with. We were joking because we just finished up right before everything shut down. And, you know, he said the team was doing really well and, you know, it's still pretty solid through the summer, but just the fatigue started wearing on them come fall, and now we need a tune-up. And so we talked about where the different pain points are and where we might be able to add things in. And one of the things that he liked initially, he said, you know, we don't need to do that whole understanding each other kind of stuff. I don't want to do an assessment for that or anything. And now he said, I think I'd like to take a step back and do that. And one of the tools that we use, it's my personal favorite, is the DISC tool. And it really helps people understand how they behave in their own comfort zone, how others behave in their comfort zone, and how you pivot into those different zones and how much energy that takes of you to be able to do that. But it's really helpful. I just love the DISC tool because it has a great help of understanding empathy, emotional intelligence, really understanding how to work with each other. But it also has nice add-ons too, because you can do additional things that are directly workable with teams, like how to engage in productive conflict and some other things, how to align vision, strategy, and execution. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you can do, an assessment piece that parlays nicely into the education and actual doing piece that we can do in a workshop. So Steve mentioned this team one versus team two. This is another big thing that we're seeing. What is your team one? Is it your downstream? Is it the team you lead? Or is it the team you sit on? And what we're finding is your team one is the team you lead. But what we're striving for, especially at an executive leadership team level, or even if it's a plant leadership team, we want that team to be team one. Your peers, that's supposed to be the team that's team one, but it's not. It's a collection of individuals who come together and talk about their initial departments or silos, if you will. They don't feel like a team. They feel like a group of individuals that come together and status report out, and then they go back to their team one. So some of the workshops we're working on is truly understanding how that team of your peers is truly your team one, and what should that look like, and how does that look different than the team that you lead. So there's a lot in that people don't understand. The way you lead on your executive leadership team is different than the way you lead your downstream. So there's a lot of things that we can work in there as well. We talked about sharing appreciation. People forget to do that celebrating success. And it's so important because you're just going from one problem to the next and firefighting, and you forget to celebrate the little successes along the way. You may celebrate those big milestones, but it's different now. You're not all going out to dinner. You're not having drinks. It's, you know, it's different. How do you share that appreciation and celebrate that success, which is critical for team growth? We talked about being vulnerable, that vulnerability-based trust, and how important that is for relationships. Steve talked about learning new skills as a team. We kind of like to do it by doing it so that they don't even realize they're learning skills. And I very often have senior leaders come back later and say, I didn't realize how much I really needed in that space. I thought I knew it all. And this was a great activity that got us all working together and realizing we didn't know what we didn't know. And Steve talked about coming out of workshops. I'm very results oriented. So when I'm working with teams, I make sure that we come out with actionable plans. So sometimes that looks like putting together a commitment agreement by the team, or, you know, Steve talked about a couple other things, team manifestos, creating team charters. But I am very focused on results and actions that I want to be able to know that when I step away from the team, that team is going full force ahead and they have the tools to be able to do that. Sometimes teams just lack the necessary structure that needs to be put in place in a time of change. Or I have some teams that really hate structure. And so I kind of have to force them to put it into place so that communications are more structured, actions and accountability and ownership is more structured. And so giving them some of those tools out of the workshop so that they can fly on their own until the next health checkup. And really not need somebody to continuously come in and facilitate. That's not our design. Our design is to be able to come in, help the team move forward, gain tools, experience, skills that they can now go on without us and come back to us when you want a health checkup. So Steve, I'm going to turn this over to you for some more practical things that they can do on their own.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about a team not even realizing that they might be going down a road and subtly changing their effectiveness to a point where it's not as healthy. So here's a list of 10 questions that we wanted to provide to you to think about your team's health and questions that you could ask your line leaders if you're in a OD talent management role to determine if your team is healthy or if they're stuck. And, you know, this is from a couple of different avenues, but particularly it's getting to not just how well they're interacting with each other, but also how well they are doing their individual role, because the team meetings kind of feed the work that you do individually. So we suggest that if you answer some of these questions, like, do team members contribute to their fullest, or does everyone help each other to achieve their best self, or are tasks organized and accountable? If you're answering no to the majority of these questions, for some people, then your team probably needs some type of process intervention and not just continue down the path with team meetings. So particularly how you could at least re-engage those teams, here's a couple of initial strategies. So the first thing is share the observation as a team leader with your team. Hey guys, I think we're stuck. Here's what I'm observing. Here's what I think it should look like. And this is important to me that you, as we said earlier, start every day excited and end every day accomplished as a mission. And I don't see that happening. Let's talk about that. Next, work with the team individually. You don't need to necessarily bring in an outside facilitator like us. I think a combination of the individual leader saying, can we talk about how you're feeling and doing on your one-on-ones, and give them some ask at team meetings. The ask might be as simple as turn on your camera or not. And it might be, something a big more mindset shift. And then the third one is, increase the frequency of your meetings. You can, with a touch of a button, meet more often, but do it intentionally. Be very clear, as Vicki mentioned earlier, about what's the purpose of this meeting and matching team process and dynamics. Don't just get on a call, put your Hollywood squares up here and start talking. Be intentional. How could we use polls and chat and features and create an intentional outcome? The outcome might be task management activities. It might be process management activities. It might be interpersonal relation building activities, which are also important for long-term health and success of the organization. So we wanted to leave you with a couple of very specific ideas and tactics. So we have 5 minutes left. Closing comments, questions. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. We're happy to offer some other ideas. Vicki, as we went through this, any specific team or team ideas from the work that you've done that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, there's one thing I noticed as I was reading through the chats also that got pointed out here as a positive in their teams is the virtualness of some of their teams, whether it was based on departments or geographic location or time zone or whatever. Sometimes the virtual team actually works a lot better, because what was happening before is perhaps the bulk of the team was in person and then 2 people were off on camera. And those 2 people probably almost always were forgotten. If you've ever been one of those 2 people that is on the call-in part and not in the room with people, it's really hard to speak up, and especially if they have it on speaker, because they're all talking, and it's really hard to interject when you're that. Well, what virtual does now is it puts everybody on the same playing field. That's it. There's a couple things that are positive and negative, right? Remember people's time zone. So be conscious. It's great that now you can pull people in across the world and everybody is an equal playing field because you're all in virtual. There's no group of live people, but be conscious of people's time zones. Don't always plan your meetings at the same time. If that means people on the Eastern time zone are having their meetings at 8 o'clock at night, or I have plenty of clients that are in Europe that are 6 hours ahead. And so I won't plan any of those meetings in the afternoon, obviously, because it makes it too late for them. So be conscious of the time zones and rotate those if necessary so that, somebody's put out maybe once every so often meetings because of their time zone, but they're not put out every single time. That's really important as well. The other thing I've gathered with some of my global clients too, is remember those people with English as a second language, and we're predominantly having our meetings in English, and understand that sometimes it takes a little bit more for them to listen to the English word or read it in chat, interpret it into their own language, and then reinterpret it back. So maybe asking for things like ask them to paraphrase what they've heard, or, making sure that it's really clear for everyone, not just everyone who English is their first language. And so some of those things are really important to make sure that all team members really feel connected and engaged. Don't forget about the ones that may just feel like a little outliers, whether it's their time zone, their geographic location, maybe it's technical challenges, and just pull them all in. And the English as a second language, I'm finding, is a big deal. It's really hard for them to interpret all of that.
Right. Well, we are about at the top of the hour. I wanted to close by saying thank you, Vicki, for spending time with us today and talking about the teams that you've been working with. And hopefully everybody found some good suggestions and ideas. I also wanted to let you know what our next 2 webinars are and the dates of those.
Oh, that's me.
That's you. So our next webinar is actually in partnership with HRCI. HRCI asked us to speak at they have a weekly webinar series, and we'll be speaking on April 15th on the topic of leadership mindset. And then our next Dion Leadership sponsored webinar will be on April 27th, and the topic will be the looming talent exodus, preparing for the post-pandemic baby boom retirement wave that we really are seeing, or wanted to help you prepare for other elements of what's going to happen over the next year. And I think this is a very important, relevant topic, and I'll be joined with one of our employment attorney friends to talk about that element of it, as well as one of our leadership coaches that specializes in our capstone coaching program to look at the retirement elements of engaging the workforce productively through the time that they leave the organization. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attendance. Hope to see you again on a future webinar. Feel free to give us a call if you have any questions or issues or want to chat about a team that you think is stuck. Happy to, and I'm sure I can speak for Vicki. We'd both be happy to entertain a phone call to give you some thoughts or ideas, and look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Anytime, feel free to reach out.